At the end of the last video, we talked about the behaviorist revolution and changing the focus of psychology from consciousness and things of the mind to behavior, observable behavior. Behaviorism actually dominated academic research-based psychology in the United States for a long time, 1913 to 1950. What this means is that it wasn't that everybody was now a behavioral psychologist or studied behaviorism. What it is that the majority of people in academia, so in colleges and universities, that were doing research in the United States we're taking a behaviorist approach to it, where we're not looking at cognitive things at all, but we're looking at observations. And so up to the 1950s, if you were taking a psychology course, a lab in a psychology course would include watching pigeons or watching rats or manipulating rats and pigeons and, training them and look at the responses with certain types of stimuli or like how do you increase behavior? How do you decrease behavior? That was psychology. You didn't think about the mind. You looked at what sorts of things in the environment elicit certain types of behaviors and how does it reinforce it or make it go away, things like that. And so that was psychology for a very, very long period of time. Why isn't it still like that? Because World War II, amongst other things, but World War II was a big thing for it. World War II inspired a lot of dissatisfaction with the behaviorist approach. Why? Well, there's only so much you can do through observations alone. There was a need to solve practical problems during the war that were being encountered by the military. And a lot of these problems were cognitive in nature. So if people are sitting, we're going to talk a little bit about this when we start talking about attention, because attention research was one of the very first types of research that was actually being done in World War II that was cognitive in nature. But you're staring at these screens for long periods of time and you start missing signals, blips saying that there might be an enemy coming in. What causes that? It's mental. That's causing that. And so it has nothing to do with the behavior and how do you reinforce certain types of behaviors. You couldn't understand or you couldn't sort of fix problems if you didn't look at the mind. So fatigue, demands of constant vigilance, and lots of times not in the perfect experimental setting, like in a lab or something like that. This was happening out in the real world, and the real world is really messy, which makes it very hard to figure out, if you're a behaviorist, to figure out all the different things that may be affecting behavior. There were also technological developments that helped start making cognitive psychology a thing. This was during the war, but then also in post-war years, and there was a lot of it had a huge impact on psychology. One of these things being communication engineering, telephone communication, radio communication. And at that period of time, people started thinking, it's like, the way this works, the telephone and the switchboards and all of that, it seems very similar to human information processing. And that was one of the analogies they actually used for cognition. It's kind of funny because over time, whatever the highest piece of technology in any given time, that's used as an analogy to the brain. So back in the Grecian times, when Aristotle was doing his thing, the wax tablet was it. And so he actually compared a wax tablet to memory and how memory worked. Here, right after the war, we're looking at communications engineering. And then also developments that we're going to talk about in just a minute having to do with computers. And so this caused a resurgence in research theories focusing on human attention. And like I said, after we get done with pattern recognition, we're going to be talking about attention. You can see the dates, of the research and see how that was one of the very, very earliest cognitive science, psychology fields. Now, computers greatly contributed to the development of cognitive psychology as well. And at that point, the mind became conceptualized as an information processing device. And you still see, well, actually the way that pretty much all cognitive textbooks are set up is actually set up in terms of an information processing sort of model. So you have input coming in from the environment, and it's being held in a short-term store. So you think about that like RAM, and then there's some filtering going on, and then pattern recognition, and then you select which part of it, and then some information goes in one way and some goes in the other, and it's being held in short-term memory. Maybe that's more RAM-like. And then you have sort of responses and then long-term storage, and you can retrieve from long-term storage. So it's very, very much a computer metaphor. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about neural networks, because neural networks are another type of metaphor for how the mind works. Computers were assigned more and more complex tasks, and part of this involved the development of artificial intelligence. We'll talk about that when we're talking about problem solving. They started, oh, we can make computers play chess, or computers can prove logical theorems. And so once again, it seemed like a good way to sort of think about the mind, because we're sort of building these mini minds in our computers. Now, around in the summer of 1958, there was a seminar at the Rand Corporation, and basically its purpose was to demonstrate to social psychologists, because social psychology was a thing back then, how computer simulation techniques can be applied to model actual human behavior. But a lot more came out of that than just this particular purpose for it. This Rand seminar really influenced several of its participants: George Miller, Eugene Galanter, Karl Pribram. These are some of the founding fathers of cognitive psychology, because they basically adopted the methods of philosophy that was talked about in the seminar and applied it to a variety of things that were cognitive in nature. Out of this came the book, Plans and Structure of Behavior. So you could see a little bit of behavior, but basically they were dissatisfied with the behaviorist approach. And they said that there's more than just behavior. You plan your behaviors, and there's a structure to the behaviors that are not, it's not entirely driven by the environment. It's something in the mind. And so you can see a copy of what the book looked like at the time. Now, this book was very, very important because it inspired a new generation of psychologists at the time and got people thinking, researchers thinking about cognitive psychology. And in 1967, Neisser wrote the very first cognitive psychology book. So 1967, that's a ways ago, but it's not, I mean, there's probably some of your parents or definitely your grandparents were alive at that point, which tells you how young cognitive psychology actually is. So to summarize all of this that we've gone so far in terms of from behaviorism on, the cognitive revolution came about through dissatisfaction with behaviorism. World War II was a big part of the cognitive revolution. And then you also saw technological advances, especially computers, in the cognitive revolution. You're going to see this over and over and over again as you go through this textbook because it was such an influence. Once again, mental processes became the focus of psychology, but they learned their lessons from introspection, and they took some of the very important methods used by behaviorists in terms of being, making sure you're making observations that are objective and quantifiable, and and can be observed by multiple observers when you're studying cognitive phenomenon. Now, after this, we're going to talk about current directions of cognitive psychology, some of the sub-branches of it, some of the techniques that are actually used when studying cognitive psychology.